She was searching for a quiet corner, a place to leave her past worries behind. The small town welcomed her warmly. New neighbors, a budding romance, peaceful evenings. But behind the calm, strange things began to happen. Unexpected gifts, missing belongings, an unknown presence always near but unseen. Who is it? And can she trust those she's let into her life? Sometimes, behind the mask of the ordinary, shadows wait, ready to reveal themselves. Rebecca cautiously walked through the familiar yet strangely distant landscape of the new town, a place where she was to spend the coming years. There were no bustling streets or noisy bars she was used to in the big city, only the quietness of small shops and half-closed windows of houses, as if shielding themselves from prying eyes. She knew starting over was never easy, but the sudden feeling that her life had now become part of a foreign, close-knit community made her feel a little scared. Rebecca rented a small house in the town center, cozy and old-fashioned, with a tilted porch and narrow windows, offering a view of a street filled with the haze of her neighbors' cigarettes and the murmur of distant lives. On her first evening, she was invited to dinner by the Fosters, a friendly and welcoming couple living a few houses down. They greeted her as if she were a long-awaited guest, with unhidden curiosity but without excessive pushiness, and invited her to a table generously laid out with dishes prepared for their new acquaintance. Sitting across from the smiling Fosters, Rebecca listened intently to their stories about the town. Mr. Foster, with a warm smile, spoke of his sons, Adam and Steve, teenagers who struggled with the monotony of small-town life but, according to their father, didn't cause much trouble. Mrs. Foster, lowering her voice conspiratorially, shared stories about the neighbors with Rebecca. "In this town, you know, we all know everything about each other." She pointed to the house across the street. "There lives a young man, Andrew, who, rumor has it, recently moved here from Canada. He seems withdrawn, avoids socializing, and remains a mystery to the neighbors." Rebecca listened, trying to remember every name and detail. With each new story, it felt as if the town was taking shape, coming to life in her imagination. The old woman who talked to herself and smoked cigarettes, the reticent Andrew across the street, the friendly Fosters. These people were to become her new surroundings, and realizing this made her momentarily breathless. In this town, where everyone supposedly knew each other's secrets, she suddenly felt she might remain a stranger. That evening, on her way home, she glanced at the dark windows of the surrounding houses, empty and silent. The shadows on the streets seemed longer and darker, and the wind in the tree branches whispered something indistinct. She felt an unfamiliar loneliness, a void that neither the warm welcome from the Fosters nor the thoughts about her upcoming job could fill. Through this feeling emerged an anxiety, a strange premonition she couldn't explain, but at the same time, something was pulling her forward, like an inevitability, a sense of a new life, a new role she was meant to play in this story, beginning to unfold in the quiet of the night-bound town. Over the past month, Rebecca gradually adjusted to the measured pace of the small town, though she felt she wasn't being accepted as quickly as she'd hoped. She tried to keep herself busy, sometimes stopping by the local cafe, going to the cinema a couple of times, and spending most of her days at work, where patients came and went. But none of her colleagues made an effort to get to know the new doctor. At times, she was overcome by a feeling of alienation, as if she remained in the shadow of this town's everyday life despite all her attempts to become a part of it. One evening, leaving the hospital, she headed toward her car, tired but finally ready to return home and spend the evening in silence. She got behind the wheel and tried to start the engine, but nothing happened. The car, as if out of spite, had stalled, and the silence of the parking lot suddenly filled with an uncomfortable emptiness. The gathering twilight surrounded her, and although there were streetlights, their light seemed weak and trembling, as if they too doubted they could protect her. The car trouble didn't surprise her. Her vehicle was old, and she knew it would need repair or replacement sooner or later. But in that moment, in this empty, lonely parking lot, The sense of unease intensified. She frantically dialed the service number, but the call wouldn't go through, leaving her to gaze at the darkening sky and helplessly look around. Just then, an SUV pulled up at the curb, not new but sturdy, with a rugged appearance that gave it a certain tough charm. A man stepped out, young, but with a reserved seriousness that evoked a mixed feeling of relief and anxiety. He looked at her and briefly asked what had happened. She explained the situation, and he introduced himself. Andrew. The name made her tense up inside. This was the mysterious neighbor she'd heard about from the Fosters. Andrew offered to help, and Rebecca, despite a slight wariness, couldn't refuse. He skillfully started the car, his hands moving confidently, though his gaze remained cold and distant. When it was all over, he merely nodded in response to her thanks and got back into his car without a word, driving off and leaving her with mixed feelings. This man stirred in her both a sense of rescue and an inexplicable sense of danger. The next morning, stepping out of her house to head to work, Rebecca noticed the familiar SUV parked across the street. Her heart skipped a beat. The very same Andrew who had helped her turned out to be her neighbor. Rebecca drove through the morning streets of the town, her thoughts returning to Andrew. He wasn't like the people she'd known before, silent, restrained, almost distant. Yet something in his gaze stirred a strange, unsettling attraction within her. She noticed that, for the first time in a long while, she was intrigued by someone so mysterious. But upon arriving at the hospital, she tried to push these thoughts aside and immersed herself in work. The day was hectic. Patients came one after another, and Rebecca barely had time to catch her breath between appointments. Near the end of the workday, she was surprised by a visit from her neighbor, Mrs. Foster, who had brought her teenage son, Adam. He sat with a sullen expression, staring at the floor, avoiding eye contact with Rebecca. Mrs. Foster, with a voice full of concern, explained that her son had recently become irritable, was sleeping poorly, and seemed withdrawn. Rebecca examined Adam carefully, asking questions to which he replied reluctantly, and gave advice that could help. Saying goodbye to them, she noted that the boy seemed troubled, as though something weighed on him. But there was no time to dwell on it. Other patients were waiting for her. Late in the evening, after returning home and barely managing to take a bath, she fell into a deep sleep, exhausted from the tense day. Morning came too quickly, and as she stepped out of her house to head to work, she suddenly noticed something unusual on her doorstep. There lay a white rose with a note attached to its stem. On the small piece of paper it read, "You are beautiful." Rebecca froze for a moment, rereading those words, feeling a mix of surprise and excitement. She had never considered herself the object of anyone's attention, especially in this town where she was nearly invisible to everyone. Could it be a joke? Or did someone genuinely decide to compliment her? Despite a slight sense of awkwardness, she decided not to give it much thought. Lost in her thoughts, Rebecca noticed Andrew mowing the lawn across the street. She decided to wave to him, but he, as before, only gave a curt nod, showing not the slightest interest. His coldness stung her a little. There was something about Andrew that drew her in, despite his aloofness, though she couldn't pinpoint what it was. Pushing all thoughts aside, Rebecca headed to work, where another busy day awaited her. But the shadow of the morning's surprise lingered at the edge of her mind, leaving her with a vague sense of mystery, yet to be unraveled. Another week passed in the monotonous rhythm that Rebecca's life had now become. Long hours at the hospital, silence at home, and the occasional sounds of her neighbors through the walls. The loneliness felt sharper, but it was as if an invisible wall surrounded her, one she couldn't easily break through. One evening, after an especially long day, Rebecca stood by the window in her bedroom, peering into the evening darkness and the familiar outlines of the houses across the street. And then she noticed someone watching her from behind her house. At first, she only caught a vague silhouette in the window of the house across from hers, but as she looked closer, she realized it was Andrew. His figure was motionless in the half-light, strangely tense, as if he was waiting for something, or someone. A soft light cast shadows across his face, and his dark eyes seemed to penetrate her space, sending a chill down her spine. She felt a disturbing sense of intrusion, something malevolent and inexplicable. What does he want? Why is he just watching and not coming over? Andrew's gaze, closed and detached, seemed to hide something inexplicable, something concealed behind his restraint. With a sharp motion, Rebecca closed the curtains, checking the locks on the doors and windows carefully, as if trying to protect herself from an invisible danger. That night, sleep eluded her. Her thoughts circled uneasily around the dark silhouette outside her window, as though Andrew's shadow loomed over her, leaving behind a cold, clammy feeling of fear. One day, after coming home from work, she found an envelope on her porch. Inside was a ticket to a baseball game scheduled for Sunday. Her heart skipped a beat. Just a few days ago, she had shared with her colleagues memories of how she used to love going to games during her college years. This gift felt both familiar and out of place. She froze, realizing this was no coincidence. The next day, casually dropping a question among her colleagues, Rebecca discovered that no one knew where the ticket had come from. Her new acquaintance and almost friend, Amanda, a nurse, just laughed and winked. "Looks like you've got a mysterious admirer. Maybe it's your enigmatic neighbor?" Rebecca laughed along with her, but her laugh was strained. Inside, a vague, uneasy feeling grew, as though something in this quiet town was watching her every move, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Rebecca spent Saturday in complete solitude, sorting through her books and cleaning, listening to music that now sounded so quiet and lonely in the empty rooms of her house. The ticket to the game lay forgotten on the table, and the thought of going alone seemed utterly absurd to her. She found herself avoiding something inexplicable, something her intuition told her to steer clear of. The evening brought a growing melancholy. As night approached, her attention was drawn to the loud music coming from the house across the street. Andrew was hosting a party. Rebecca walked to the window, lightly pulling back the curtain. She could make out young figures, laughing people, faintly lit by the porch lights. Andrew was among a group of girls and guys, and though they all seemed immersed in the fun, he stood apart in a way. He didn't appear to be part of their joy, as if he were both there and elsewhere at the same time. Time passed, and Rebecca was already preparing for bed, when the sound of the doorbell startled her. She froze, her heart racing. Standing on her doorstep was Andrew, his walk a bit unsteady, his warm, slightly tipsy gaze unfamiliar on his usually reserved face. He hesitantly, almost shyly, invited her to join their gathering, saying his friends wanted to meet her. Rebecca was taken aback, but the genuine interest in his eyes persuaded her to accept. When she entered Andrew's house, she was met by the friendly, cheerful faces of his friends. She was surprised at how warmly they welcomed her, how casual they were despite the late hour and the informal setting. Andrew, however, remained quiet, his eyes fixed almost unblinkingly on Rebecca, harboring a mysterious, heavy emotion that stirred an unusual excitement within her. Their gazes met more and more frequently, and she felt the tension between them growing, so palpable that it seemed each breath was charged with this unspoken magnetism. Andrew took her hand, and the electric touch of his fingers awakened something in Rebecca that had long been dormant, hidden and unexplored. He invited her to dance, and everything outside that moment seemed to vanish. Their movements were slow, but his hands and gaze conveyed more than words could. When the music faded, Andrew announced to his friends that the party was over. Rebecca felt a moment of embarrassment, but when their eyes met, she realized she would not be leaving. The room emptied, and the silence suddenly took on a special, enchanting depth. Andrew approached her again, his gaze piercing, while her heart pounded with anticipation. She knew that tonight held something more, and she was not mistaken. Waking up at Andrew's the next morning, Rebecca found a short note on the pillow. "Went to work, see you later." She read it several times, feeling a strange, yet familiar sensation, a mix of disappointment and bitterness. The entire previous night seemed to have lost some of its charm. Rebecca quickly gathered her things and returned to her place, trying to calm herself and convince herself that there was no malice in his brief message. She reminded herself that he had promised her nothing and decided to let him have his life, while she would have hers. A few days passed, and they still didn't meet. As Rebecca returned home, she saw the light in his windows burning late into the night, but he made no attempt to reach out. Each evening, an unpleasant feeling grew within her, a slight, yet steadily increasing pang of alienation. On Saturday morning, Amanda invited Rebecca to a birthday party, an unexpected but much welcomed event. Rebecca gladly accepted the invitation, happy that someone in this small town wanted her to be part of their circle. The party was lively. She met Amanda's friends, and a few men showed interest in her, especially enjoying asking her questions about life in the big city. For Rebecca, this attention was pleasant, especially after Andrew's recent indifference. The next day, she met one of her new acquaintances, Paul, at a cafe. He was a tall, blond man with a constant smile and an easygoing nature. Paul joked a lot, his loud laughter was infectious, but soon it began to slightly irritate her, seeming superficial and hollow. She realized she wasn't interested in continuing the acquaintance with him and, after thanking him for the coffee, politely said goodbye. Monday morning began as usual. Arriving at work, Rebecca prepared to see her patients as always. But as she approached her desk, she noticed a small box carefully left on the edge. Perplexed, she asked her colleagues if anyone knew who had left it, but they only shrugged. With a mix of curiosity and slight apprehension, Rebecca opened the box. As soon as the lid lifted, she saw something that made her recoil. Inside was a moldy cookie, crawling with wriggling worms. Attached to it was a short note, which struck her as more ominous than anything before. "Don't do that again. I'm watching you." She dropped the box onto the desk and stepped back, trying to suppress the nausea and contain the shock that overtook her. Rebecca struggled to regain her composure after that ominous discovery. Could it have been Andrew? Her thoughts were tangled, but she pushed them aside, trying not to give in to suspicion. After all, despite his reserved nature, Andrew had always seemed friendly, albeit distant. However, the unsettling feeling of anxiety lingered, and following her first instinct, Rebecca went to the sheriff's office. The sheriff was an older, weary man with eyes accustomed to the mundane incidents of a small town. He listened to her story attentively, jotted down the details, nodded thoughtfully, but couldn't entirely hide a hint of skepticism in his eyes. "You see, Miss Harper, I've noted everything, and we'll do what we can. In the meantime, try to avoid walking alone and stay vigilant. I'm sure it's just someone's poor idea of a joke," he muttered, bidding her goodbye. A few days passed in an oppressive silence, interrupted only by memories of strange notes and threatening messages. Rebecca tried to bury herself in work, to forget her fears, but the dread had settled deep within her, turning her daily routine into a backdrop for vague suspicions. On the third day, as she was returning home from work, there was an unexpected knock on the door. She flinched, instinctively tense, and barely hid her surprise when she saw Andrew standing on the doorstep. He looked tired, but somehow more open than before, apologizing as he explained his long absence. "Work, damn it, just wouldn't let go," he muttered with an apologetic smile, and, after a moment of hesitation, suggested they meet at a cafe. Although Rebecca felt some doubts, she agreed, reasoning that a public place would be safe. The evening passed surprisingly smoothly and warmly. Andrew was reserved yet attentive, and in the rare moments when a faint smile crossed his face, he seemed like a completely different person. Rebecca noticed how their eyes met, how his quiet remarks resonated within her, awakening long-forgotten feelings. When they left the cafe, Andrew, unexpectedly considerate, walked her home, lingering reluctantly on her porch. They chatted about small things, the kind of trivialities that seem important in moments of gentle closeness. And finally, as the night air grew cooler, he hesitated just a moment before pulling her gently toward him, his lips brushing softly against hers. It was cautious and tender, but within that kiss was an unspoken warmth and affection that melted her fears away. For a fleeting moment, Rebecca forgot everything except the look in his eyes, hiding a strange, alluring mystery. One quiet evening, as Rebecca popped into a small local store for milk and bread, she ran into Paul. He recognized her right away, smiled, and as if delighted by the coincidence, suggested they grab a coffee together. Rebecca, after a slight hesitation, agreed, deciding that a short conversation in a crowded cafe wouldn't hurt. Paul was genuine and open. His friendliness sparked a bit of warmth in her, but within minutes she realized that this encounter was just that. A casual meeting, nothing more. Sitting at a small round table in the corner of the cafe, Paul enthusiastically shared his future plans, speaking of his dreams to travel, of his desire for more than what the small town could offer. But when his chatter paused for a moment, Rebecca, feeling an obligation to be honest, decided to share her feelings. With a gentle smile, she said, "You're truly a wonderful person, Paul, but I'm afraid all I can offer is friendship." She noticed his face cloud slightly, but he quickly regained his calm, cheerful demeanor, nodding and assuring her that he understood. Paul accepted it without any resentment or disappointment, giving her a genuine smile as he said, "No worries. We can always be friends." Their conversation ended peacefully, without drama. They exchanged polite words, wished each other well, and went their separate ways. Yet, as Rebecca walked home, she felt a subtle sense of relief. A strange feeling, as if she'd freed herself from some invisible obligation, from a weight pressing down on her heart. The next morning, as she stepped out of her house, Rebecca froze in place. All 4 tires on her car were hopelessly deflated. A wave of anger and fear washed over her. Who could have done this? Why? Her thoughts raced, trying to pinpoint anyone who might hold resentment towards her. Maybe Andrew. But how could this be explained by his recent attempts to reconnect with her? Rebecca quickly reached out to the sheriff, hoping he might shed some light on this strange threat. But his response left her feeling helpless. "Things like this happen sometimes, miss," he said with a shrug. "Local kids like to mess around, that's all." There was neither suspicion nor determination in the sheriff's words, but Rebecca's intuition told her that this incident wasn't just some kid's prank. Something darker, unseen, and purposeful seemed to be lurking nearby. Later that evening, Andrew called and suggested they meet. However, a surge of tension overwhelmed her, and she couldn't bring herself to agree. Her voice sounded cold and distant. "No, sorry, I can't tonight." As she hung up, questions swirled in her mind. What did she actually know about him? Where was he from? What did he do? Why was he so quiet and mysterious? This man seemed shrouded in secrecy, and Rebecca was no longer sure she was ready to accept it. In the following days, an uneasy feeling lingered, and she began cautiously asking her new acquaintances about him. But she got the same response each time. No one knew Andrew well, and everyone seemed to prefer avoiding discussions about him, as if it were an uncomfortable or off-limits topic. Soon after that, waking up early one morning, Rebecca found a huge bouquet of fresh flowers on her doorstep. Bright and delicate, they drew her in with their beauty, yet instead of joy, an inexplicable unease took root in her heart. Whoever had left them, the gesture felt devoid of romance, more like a reminder of an intrusive presence, gradually infiltrating her life, capturing her thoughts, and leaving only a cold trace of anxiety. Rebecca had finally decided to keep Andrew at a distance. Each time he came by, she found an excuse not to let him in, but that didn't mean her thoughts were free from him. The subconscious attraction was too strong, and she still secretly watched him from the window, when he left the house, washed his car, or mowed the lawn. Sometimes their eyes would meet by chance, and in those moments, she had to force herself to hold back, to resist the urge to go to him and lose herself in that electrifying feeling that had once already taken over them both. As the holidays approached, Rebecca decided to visit her parents for a short break, to escape this slow-burning uncertainty. She booked a ticket for a bus and then a plane, planning to leave town for a few days to clear her mind. Saying goodbye to her colleagues, she told them she would be back soon and that she simply needed a change of scenery. Late in the evening, as she drove up to her house, she saw Andrew getting out of his car. He glanced in her direction and gave a barely noticeable nod, as if to acknowledge her need for distance. Something stirred inside her, but she forced herself to nod back and, trying not to betray her emotions, went inside. She spent the rest of the evening packing and preparing a light dinner, intending to check her tickets before bed. However, when she went to the table where the tickets were supposed to be, Rebecca found that they were gone. She searched the entire room, but they had vanished without a trace. She remembered placing them there as soon as she got home, confident that it was the safest spot. With each passing moment, her fear and indignation grew stronger. Someone had dared to enter her house, to move her belongings, as if her personal boundaries meant nothing. Her heart pounded with rage and helplessness, but even more than that, a lingering anxiety gnawed at her, the persistent suspicion that this wasn't an accident, that somehow it was connected to Andrew. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her shaking hands. This time she decided that she would no longer tolerate any intrusion into her life. If it was him, she would make him admit it. She put on her coat and with determination headed towards the house across the street, firmly resolved to demand answers. Rebecca found Andrew in his driveway, standing with a wrench in hand and intently studying his car's engine. She didn't even try to hold back. She stepped closer, and when he looked up at her, her gaze must have revealed everything: anxiety, fear, and a simmering anger. She immediately burst into a shout. The words erupted from her throat in sharp bursts, one after another. She was tired of these endless games, of his secret interference in her life, of the constant feeling that someone was breathing down her neck. She demanded that he leave her alone, that he stop this ridiculous and frightening pursuit. Andrew seemed frozen by her anger. He took a step back, lowering the wrench, and only after she fell silent, he quietly asked what she meant. His face showed genuine confusion and concern, which unexpectedly threw her off balance. Still breathing heavily, Rebecca told him everything about the strange gifts, the notes, the slashed tires. Desperation colored her voice as she said she couldn't think of anyone else but him. Andrew listened in silence, growing paler with each word. When she finally fell quiet, he lowered his head, searching for words, and finally, somewhat sheepishly, admitted that the baseball game ticket had been his idea. He explained that he had once overheard her mention at the hospital that she loved baseball and decided to make this small invitation, hoping they could meet there. But she never showed up, and everything that followed was as much a mystery to him as it was to her. Rebecca froze. All her anger suddenly evaporated, leaving her utterly bewildered. Before her stood a man, sincere and touched by her pain. The worry in his eyes and that strange, silent fear began to recede, replaced by something deeper, warmer. She lowered her gaze, unable to hide her embarrassment. Andrew, carefully, as if afraid to startle her, stepped closer, reached out, and embraced her, comforting her like a wounded child. His embrace was gentle yet strong, as though an unbreakable fortress had risen around her. In that moment, it felt as if the entire world had vanished, leaving only the two of them, his warmth and those quiet, unspoken feelings that began to seep through her fear. Rebecca looked at him, and he returned her gaze, filled with silent understanding. Everything they had been so afraid to say to each other was now spoken through their eyes. This attraction was inevitable, and they both knew they couldn't stay apart. Without letting go of each other, they silently walked toward her house and disappeared behind the door, leaving all fears and doubts behind. Waking in the middle of the night, Rebecca immediately sensed the smell of smoke wafting through the open window. Her heart froze, and barely managing to control her fear, she rushed to the window. Outside, St. Andrew's car was ablaze like a giant torch, and nearby she caught a glimpse of a shadow, a slim figure who, noticing movement in the house, quickly disappeared into the night. Rebecca screamed, and within seconds, Andrew was beside her, sleepy but instantly aware of the situation. They both ran downstairs, simultaneously calling the fire department. Within minutes, the yard was filled with flames and shouts, but once the firefighters managed to get the fire under control, it was clear that this had been an act of arson. The police confirmed that someone had intentionally tried to harm Andrew, and neither Rebecca nor he had any doubts. Their tormentor was not going to back down. 2 long, tense weeks passed, during which Andrew scarcely left Rebecca's side. He picked her up from work, escorted her home, and stayed with her overnight. She still lived in fear, but his presence gave her an unexpected sense of security. Now, convinced that her suspicions had been unfounded, she finally allowed herself to enjoy this time together. Then one day, as evening approached, there was a knock on her door. The sheriff stood on her doorstep, his expression serious, his voice quieter than usual. He invited Rebecca to sit and told her that a few days earlier, the station had received a disturbing call from a schoolgirl who complained about a classmate's behavior. According to her, the boy had been stalking her and later began making threats. During the investigation, they discovered his locker filled with strange items, women's jewelry, random objects, photos. Among them were those very tickets that had disappeared from Rebecca's house before her trip to visit her parents. Rebecca struggled to breathe as she listened, unable to believe what she was hearing. The sheriff continued. During questioning, the boy confessed to being obsessed with her. He had collected everything that reminded him of her, keeping it as trophies. His name was Adam, and to her horror, he was the son of her neighbors, the foster family, who had welcomed her so warmly when she moved in. Rebecca's heart tore with conflicting emotions. The entire chain of strange incidents, notes, and frightening gifts finally made sense. She was genuinely afraid, but at least now she knew what had been lurking behind all these events. Andrew, who had not left her side, gently took her hand, trying to reassure her. They exchanged a look, and in Andrew's eyes, she saw understanding. Dark, troubled, yet promising that they would face this ordeal together.